Hello, I'm Lee Sales. Welcome to this special budget program. Australia is in deficit to the tune of $18 billion, more than anyone anticipated. That's the headline news out of this year's federal budget. This time last year, the Gillard government was promising with certainty a $1.5 billion surplus. It's blaming revenue write-downs for its budget trouble, but nonetheless is promising this economic plan will make Australia stronger, smarter and fairer. The government is predicting a return to 8 years of surpluses starting in 2016-17, but the question is whether it will still be in power then to be held to account. This budget isn't the average election year handout bonanza. Instead, there are only two new big-ticket, high-cost items: disability insurance and extra school funding. And there are spending cuts to go with them. The baby bonus will be dumped, there'll be changes to Medicare benefits, and corporate tax will be under scrutiny. The Treasurer, Wayne Swan, is on his way to our studio right now from the Parliamentary Chamber, and we'll also get the opposition's immediate reaction from the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey, as well as our panel of economic, business and welfare experts. But first, with the budget nuts and bolts, here's Chief Political Correspondent Mark Simkin.
One of the people who put this budget together reckons there's never been anything like it in an election year. The cuts aren't confined to the wealthy, bribes and sweeteners are noticeably absent, and for Wayne Swan, red is the new black. This is what he promised this night last year. The much prized and much promised surpluses have disappeared, replaced with a deficit of $18 billion next financial year, an $11 billion deficit the year after, and eventually what a now cautious Treasurer is calling a balanced budget in 2015-16. This government's first surplus is now forecast for the last year of the forward estimates, a decade after Labor came to power.
Now, I know many people have said this budget is about change, and in some respects that's very true. It's definitely set in very different economic circumstances to a year ago, a year in which we were obviously meant to come to surplus.
G'day, Treasurer, how are you? To get to surplus and pay for education and disability care, Labor's unveiled cuts and savings worth $43 billion. Peter Costello's baby bonus is being thrown out with the bathwater, absorbed into the family tax benefit Part A. At present, families earning up to $150,000 are eligible for $5,000 for the first child, $3,000 for the second child. The new scheme's eligibility is tighter and its payments will be lower, saving the government more than $1 billion. Tens of thousands of families are expected to miss out, starting next March, a little over 9 months away. And that's not the only family-unfriendly measure. Half a dozen payments will be better targeted, to use the government's euphemism. Some will be capped, some will no longer increase with inflation, and others will have new income tests. All up a hit of $2.5 billion.
If we're going to keep a strong family payment system in Australia, it has to be sustainable over time, and it has to be targeted.
The medical tax offset will be phased out. That means people who spend more than $2,000 a year on medical expenses will no longer get to claim a tax rebate. Smokers face a double whammy. There's another increase in the tobacco levy, adding 7 cents to a packet of cigarettes. Some people face more tax and more tax paperwork. Trusts, super funds, sole traders and large investors will have to pay income tax monthly as they go, earning the government $1.5 billion over the forward estimates.
I couldn't live with myself if I walked in here and said that in face of the biggest revenue write-down virtually in history, that I was just going to ignore it because it was politically inconvenient.
Big business faces its share of cuts. A swag of so-called corporate loopholes will be closed, increasing tax receipts by more than $4 billion. Changes to import charges will net the government nearly $700 million, while the R&D tax incentive will be limited to companies with a turnover of less than $20 billion, tipping yet another $1 billion into government coffers. Behold the incredible shrinking carbon price. Originally forecast to be $29 a tonne in 2015, it's now expected to be just $12, punching a big hole in the budget. Industry compensation will be cut accordingly. The reductions total nearly $4 billion. The budget bottom line's also been rocked by a collapse in company tax, higher numbers of asylum seekers and the hole left by an underperforming mining tax.
Whether it's 100 million, 300 million or 5 billion over the forward estimates, it's 5 billion more the country is getting than they get out of the other mob.
Most of the cuts will be channelled into what Labor considers the budget centrepieces. $14 billion goes into disability care over the next 7 years, nearly $10 billion into education funding, and billions more for road and rail projects over the forward estimates. You'll hear all about it. Tens of millions of tax dollars have been set aside for Gonski and NDIS advertising campaigns, starting next month.
You say there's nothing in this. This is a huge change to education in Australia.
So this budget vows to leave major Labor legacies, lays funding landmines for an Abbott government, and in the meantime dares the coalition to oppose cuts that will fund disability insurance and the so-called Gonski reforms. It all suggests a government well aware of its own mortality. Maybe it is an election budget after all.